What if I told you that in a third world war, the countries everyone expects to dominate might not even make it to the finish line, and the real winners could be nations most people can't even find on a map? Right now, while superpowers are locked in a staring contest that could go nuclear at any moment, there are countries quietly positioning themselves to emerge as the ultimate victors of a conflict they might never actually fight in. We're talking about nations that could end up controlling the world's most critical resources, dominating global trade routes, and basically writing the rules for whatever comes after the smoke clears. And honestly, when you see which countries these are and why they're positioned to win, it's going to blow your mind, because it completely flips everything you think you know about global power. Here's the thing about World War III that nobody really talks about. Everyone's obsessed with who has the most nukes, the biggest army, or the most advanced fighter jets. But in a modern global conflict, the countries that win aren't necessarily the ones doing the most fighting. They're the ones that can keep their economies running, feed their people, maintain global connections, and position themselves as indispensable to whoever's left standing when the dust settles. Real talk. In the 21st century, geography, resources, and strategic neutrality might matter way more than raw military power. And there are a handful of countries right now that have hit the geopolitical jackpot in ways that would make them the surprise MVPs of any major conflict. Let's start with the most shocking candidate on this list: Argentina. Yeah, you heard that right. Argentina. The country most people associate with beef, tango, and economic crises could actually emerge as one of the biggest winners of World War III, and it's not even close when you look at the fundamentals. See, Argentina sits at the southern tip of South America, literally as far from the main conflict zones as you can possibly get. While World War III would most likely center around flashpoints in Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, and the Middle East, Argentina would be chilling in a hemisphere that's largely insulated from direct military action. But distance is just the beginning of why this matters. Argentina is absolutely stacked with natural resources in a way that would make it basically immune to the supply chain chaos that would devastate most countries during a global war. We're talking about one of the world's largest producers of soybeans, corn, and wheat. When global food supplies get disrupted because shipping lanes are blocked, ports are destroyed, and agricultural regions become battlefields, Argentina would suddenly become the grocery store everyone desperately needs. And it gets crazier. Argentina has massive reserves of lithium in its northern regions, part of what's called the lithium triangle. In a world where military technology, communications, and basically everything runs on batteries, controlling lithium means controlling the future. Argentina also has significant oil and natural gas reserves, particularly in the Vaca Muerta shale formation, which is one of the largest shale deposits outside North America. Energy independence during a global conflict. That's literally priceless. But here's where Argentina's position gets truly wild. The country has relatively good relations with basically everyone. They're not locked into rigid military alliances that would force them to pick sides. During World War III, Argentina could play the role that Switzerland played in World War II, but with way more resources and leverage. They could sell food, energy, and critical minerals to whoever can pay, basically becoming the world's most essential neutral party. And because they're so far from the action, there's no real military threat that could force them into the conflict. No nation fighting in World War III is going to have the resources to project power all the way to southern South America when they've got existential threats on their doorstep. The economic windfall for Argentina would be insane. Countries at war would be desperate for their exports, willing to pay premium prices, and Argentina would have the leverage to demand payment in hard currency, gold, or whatever holds value when global financial systems are in chaos. The agricultural sector alone would explode. When Ukraine and Russia, two of the world's biggest grain exporters, can't ship food because the Black Sea is a war zone, and when supply chains across Asia and Europe are shattered, Argentina becomes one of the few places still producing and exporting at scale. We're talking about a scenario where Argentine farmers and mining companies become insanely wealthy, the government's coffers fill up with foreign currency, and the country finally gets the economic stability it's been chasing for decades. Now let's talk about New Zealand, because this island nation in the South Pacific has basically won the geographic lottery when it comes to surviving and thriving during a global catastrophe. New Zealand is so isolated that it's already become the go-to destination for billionaire preppers building bunkers and buying up land in case society collapses. But in a World War III scenario, that isolation becomes a massive strategic advantage for the entire country, not just the ultra-rich trying to escape. New Zealand has everything it needs to be completely self-sufficient. The country produces more than enough food to feed its population, with a massive agricultural sector focused on dairy, meat, and produce. They've got renewable energy infrastructure that means they're not dependent on imported oil or gas. Geothermal, hydro, and wind power keep the lights on without needing vulnerable supply chains. And they're surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean that acts as a natural moat against any military aggression. No country fighting in World War III is going to waste resources trying to invade or attack New Zealand when there are actual strategic targets that matter to the war effort. But New Zealand's real ace in the hole is its political positioning. The country has strong ties with Western democracies through the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. But it's also maintained relatively pragmatic relationships with China and other Asian nations. During a global conflict, New Zealand could position itself as a neutral meeting ground, a place where diplomacy could still happen when everywhere else is a war zone. Think about it, if you need a location for peace talks, prisoner exchanges, or back-channel negotiations, you want somewhere that's secure, neutral, and literally unreachable by the chaos engulfing the rest of the planet. New Zealand fits that bill perfectly. The country would also become a haven for refugees with money and skills. When World War III breaks out, anyone who can afford to get out is going to look for the safest place on Earth. And New Zealand is going to be at the top of that list. This means an influx of wealth, talent, and human capital. Scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, doctors, all the people who make economies work would be flooding into New Zealand, bringing their resources and expertise with them. The country's population would boom with educated, productive people desperate for safety. That's not a burden. That's an economic and intellectual windfall that would set New Zealand up to be a major player in whatever global order emerges after the war. Chile is another South American country that would low-key dominate in a World War III scenario. And it's all about copper and lithium. Chile controls about a third of the world's copper production. And copper is absolutely essential for modern warfare and technology. Electrical wiring, ammunition casings, electronics, ships, aircraft, you name it, it needs copper. During a major conflict, demand for copper would go through the roof while supply chains everywhere else are getting destroyed. Chile, sitting safely on the western edge of South America with ocean protecting one side and the Andes Mountains providing a natural barrier on the other, would be pumping out copper and selling it at astronomical prices. And just like Argentina, Chile has massive lithium reserves. The Atacama Desert holds some of the world's highest quality, easiest to extract lithium. In a world where every military, every communication system, every piece of modern technology needs batteries, controlling lithium extraction means controlling a choke point that everyone desperately needs. Chile could basically name its price, and countries would have to pay it because there's no alternative. You can't fight a 21st century war without access to these resources, and Chile has them in abundance. Chile also benefits from incredible geographic isolation and security. The country is literally a thin strip between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains. There's no realistic way for any fighting nation to invade or threaten Chile during a global conflict. They're not strategically located enough to be worth the resources it would take to attack them, but they are essential enough that everyone needs to stay on their good side. That's the sweet spot you want to be in during World War III. Now we got to talk about Indonesia. And this is where things get really interesting because Indonesia is actually somewhat close to potential conflict zones in the South China Sea. But its position could still make it a winner in surprising ways. Indonesia controls some of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet, specifically the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Strait. These waterways are essential for global trade, particularly for energy shipments from the Middle East to East Asia. About a quarter of the world's traded oil passes through these straits. In a World War III scenario centered around the Pacific, whoever controls these choke points controls access to resources, trade, and military movement. Indonesia, with its massive archipelago of over 17,000 islands, could fortify these straits and basically become the gatekeeper of the Pacific. Countries would have to negotiate with Indonesia, pay transit fees, or request permission to move military assets through their waters. That's incredible leverage. And because Indonesia has the fourth largest population in the world, a growing economy, and a decent-sized military, they're not some small nation that can be pushed around easily. Indonesia also has natural resources that would be in high demand: palm oil, natural gas, coal, nickel, and tin. The country is the world's largest producer of palm oil, which is used in everything from food to fuel. Their nickel reserves are crucial for battery production, another resource that becomes critical in a high-tech conflict. Indonesia could play both sides, maintaining relationships with China, the United States, and everyone in between, extracting maximum benefit from its strategic position without committing fully to either camp. The risk for Indonesia is that they're not as geographically isolated as Argentina or New Zealand, so they'd have to play their cards carefully. But if they can maintain neutrality, or at least avoid becoming a battlefield, they'd emerge from World War III as a regional powerhouse with way more influence and wealth than they have now. They'd be the country everyone needs to work with to access Asian markets and resources. Brazil deserves a mention here because it's basically a continental-sized country, with resources for days and geographic isolation from major conflict zones. Brazil has vast agricultural capacity, potentially the most important rainforest ecosystem on the planet, massive reserves of iron ore and other minerals, and a large, relatively modern military. In a World War III scenario, Brazil could become the agricultural powerhouse of the Western Hemisphere, supplying food to whoever can afford it, while remaining safely distant from the fighting. Brazil's challenge is political stability and infrastructure. The country has historically struggled with internal corruption and economic management. But in a world where everyone else is dealing with bombs dropping and economies collapsing, Brazil's problems start looking pretty manageable by comparison. Foreign investment would pour in from people desperate to get their wealth somewhere safe. Brazil could finally leverage its natural advantages into becoming the dominant power in South America, no longer living in the shadow of the United States. Here's what all these countries have in common. They're far from the main theaters of conflict. They have resources everyone desperately needs. They're not locked into rigid military alliances that force them into the fight, and they have geographic features that make them either impossible or pointless to attack. These aren't the countries with the biggest militaries or the most advanced weapons. They're the countries that can survive, maintain functioning societies, and supply whatever the warring nations need. That's the real power in a global conflict. Think about what World War III would actually look like. The major powers, the United States, China, Russia, and their respective allies, would be locked in devastating combat across multiple continents. Supply chains would collapse, trade would halt, food and energy would become scarce in even wealthy countries. Millions would die, and trillions in wealth would evaporate. Cities would be destroyed. Infrastructure would crumble. Entire regions would become uninhabitable. And while that nightmare unfolds, these neutral countries would be operating relatively normally, selling their resources, taking in refugees and wealth, and building their future positions. When the fighting finally stops, whenever that is, the traditional superpowers would be exhausted, broke, and potentially fragmented. The real winners would be the countries that kept the lights on, fed their people, and positioned themselves as indispensable to whoever survived. Argentina could be the agricultural and energy superpower of the Southern Hemisphere. New Zealand could be the Switzerland of the Pacific, the neutral ground everyone trusts. Chile could control the minerals the world needs to rebuild. Indonesia could dominate Southeast Asian trade and transit. Brazil could finally become the regional hegemon it's always had the potential to be. The geopolitical order that emerges after World War III wouldn't look anything like the world we live in now. The nations that won by not fighting would have resources, wealth, infrastructure, and populations ready to engage with whatever comes next. The nations that fought would be dealing with reconstruction, debt, political upheaval, and populations traumatized by years of war. The power shift would be absolutely massive. And here's the truly wild part. These countries know this. Their governments and strategic planners understand that neutrality and resource control could be worth more than military alliances. That's why you see countries like Argentina and Brazil maintaining diplomatic relationships with everyone. That's why New Zealand quietly prepares to be self-sufficient. That's why Indonesia carefully navigates between China and the West. They're not naive. They're playing a long game, positioning themselves for a scenario everyone hopes never happens. But that gets more plausible every year. So yeah, when people ask who would win World War III, they're usually thinking about who has the most aircraft carriers or the best missiles. But the real answer might be the countries that are smart enough to stay out of it while making themselves absolutely essential to everyone who can't. The countries that could win World War III are the ones most people aren't even thinking about, and that's exactly why they'd win.